This is how I grew to love the fairy tale villain. So, I read a lot of books growing up. I read a wide variety of books, but I was introduced to the fairy tales very early on because the fairy tales were considered very childlike, although they were quite dark. However, the fairy tale princesses were introduced to me as well, and I grew up watching and reading about Cinderella and characters such as Snow White. Now, I didn't particularly care for the characters. I don't know, there was just something amazingly helpless about them, and they didn't seem particularly bright or sharp. They just seemed very bland and boring and very eager to please. And one day my grandfather arrived with a gift, and he gave me, back in the day when we had recordings, he gave me Sleeping Beauty. Now, watching Sleeping Beauty on my own for the first time was very interesting because it seemed a bit silly at first, but as the movie went on, I realised it was much darker than it appeared. And when Maleficent came on my screen, I was absolutely besotted with her for some reason I still don't understand. However, the other characters in the series, or in the movie, I found rather silly. I found Prince Philip idiotic. I found the two fairy godmothers rather boring. There was Flora, Fauna, and I don't remember the third one. But the third lady, the third fairy godmother, who is very petite, short, curvy, or carrying a bit more weight. Well, she was fascinating. I found her interesting because she had a bit of spunk in her, and she had a bit of fight. So I fell in love, but not with Aurora Rose, but Maleficent. That's when I started to realise that, because I was writing at the time already. And it taught me a very important lesson about characters and characterization and writing characters. There weren't many layers to Aurora Rose or her father or Prince Philip. There was nothing. It wasn't like dealing with an onion. There were no layers. There was just one. They were very one-dimensional. But with Maleficent, there was so much more. She had this bird who she adored. She lived with these odd creatures in her castle, which is all very dark. And I quite liked the dark aesthetic of her castle, by the way. And it made me wonder if I liked darker villains or if I just liked characters that had different layers to their personality. Gradually, I realised that fairy tale villains appealed to me a lot more for a few reasons. First of all, they're multi-layered. They have different moods, different. They can be unpredictable. They can be very. You never know what they're going to do next, because if you recall the scene where the fairy Maleficent comes in to see the baby, and they all withdraw in horror when they see her, and then she's all sweet and nice, and then she switches and she puts the curse on the baby. For me, that was a very powerful moment. There's also the range of emotions that the villains display. They can be very lovely to the people around them. They can also be very mean to the people around them. But then they show a very dark side of their character to the people outside that circle. And I realised that these traits that a lot of these villains possessed were very good for backstories. And one thing I really love is backstories and prequels to series, because that's when you realise that they've written the villain to be so bad. As you grow older, you start to wonder what made them so bad in the first place. And I think in terms of creativity, you can do so much more with a villain. It opens so many more doors. And I think that's why I like to write characters who are a bit dark. Everyone has a darkness within them. They're not all perfect. If you look at any of my characters in any of my books, it's never black and white. There's always a lot of grey going on, and I think that's because it gives you the chance to write the character into a whole range of positions and a whole range of emotions, and also play with them in different parts of the book. Like, do you want them to become a villain, or do you want them to dip their toes into villainy, or do you want them to be a hero fighting the urge to do something bad? So I think villains make for much more interesting stories. And I think a good villain is every author's dream, because a good villain makes the books just a bit more interesting. And I do believe that whoever believed that we read the fairy tales for the doe-eyed, waspish-waisted, innocent girls is very mistaken, because a lot of the books I read for the villains. And when I started to read the fairy tales, not the princess fairy tales, but the darker fairy tales about, maybe Hansel and Gretel and all those other characters, I would feel remorse, I found, for people like the witch. You had Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I felt remorse for the Three Bears. So it was interesting how I tended to take the side of the villains, so to speak. They weren't all villains, but the villains, so to speak. And I do believe that people resonate more with villains because they're just more interesting. And that is why we're also seeing a resurgence in fairy tale retellings, because although these fairy tales were written in such a way where they wanted us to admire the young women in the books, that's not what's happening. What the readers are starting to see now, and the people watching the movies and the film adaptations, is how silly a lot of the characters were. They weren't particularly strong. They were probably underfoot, probably in abusive conditions. But you start to see all the characters all around them, and then it makes for very good fairy tale retellings, because it helps you explore why the other characters could have done what they did, and it makes for a very good story. I haven't actually read any fairy tale retellings yet, but I have met a few people who've written some and been really successful with them, and I would like to know what your take is on the fairy tale retellings, and how in the modern times we're starting to see the fairy tales in a very different manner, which is very opposite to the way they were written, because obviously we were supposed to see the princesses in a very innocent way. So please do let me know your comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.